the first thing I want to do is just thank our funders, the Government of Norway and the United Kingdom, for supporting this work. Really what we're going to do today is just take you on a journey of the issue of drivers. As Steve mentioned, we're going to hear from some countries specifically, and really we're hoping that for the second half of this, we can really engage all of you discussing this issue. So welcome your input and your ideas. I also just want to recognize Nikki Desi. Nikki, maybe you'd like to stand up. She was the other co-author with us. Welcome. The primary reason that we are here is in the Cancun decision. The COP requested the SBSTA to identify land use change, and forestry activities in developing countries, in particular those that are linked to the drivers of deforestation and forest degradation, identify the associated methodological issues to estimate emissions and removals resulting from these activities, assess the potential contribution of these activities to the mitigation of climate change, and report on the findings and outcomes of this work to the COP18. So this is timely. It's important for us to spend some time on this issue. We will hear from Peter Graham, SBSTA co-chair, later on SBSTA's ideas about drivers and some of the actions potentially to happen there. So we'll look forward to Peter's comments. And this really is why we're here today. So I'm going to hand it over to Martin. So Martin is going to quickly go over the assessment of current drivers. I will, after he speaks, I will talk a little bit about the future drivers. And Martin is also going to take us through the role of drivers in national forest monitoring and in developing forest reference levels. So now I'm going to turn it over to Martin.
Thank you, Gabi. Good afternoon, everyone, also from my side. As already said, I'm going to start it off by giving a bit of an overview of the current drivers and how drivers and driver analysis link also a bit to monitoring and reference levels. So one may say more the technical side of the whole drivers discussion. Firstly, perhaps known, but good to reiterate that if we talk about drivers, we usually mean several things. And in particular in the scientific literature, what's often separated is between proximate or direct drivers or causes, which are direct human activities or immediate actions that change the forest or forest carbon, versus underlying or indirect drivers and activities. So these direct activities are, for example, some piece of forest being converted by agriculture for subsistence, for example. It's a direct activity, whereas the underlying cause is demand for food, for example, or related population growth. So these direct drivers are more specific things that can be often linked also to a specific location, whereas these underlying drivers are usually a complex interaction between social, economic, political, cultural, technological things, and they're often distant from the actual change that we see in the landscape. And in that sense, it's also important to address them separately, and I'll come back to that. Particularly direct drivers, from a monitoring point of view, they're easier to assess and sometimes the link between direct and underlying are sometimes not very easy. Sometimes it's pretty clear, but sometimes it's not very easy. But oftentimes it's these underlying ones that are very important that need to be addressed, in particular if somebody has the intention to change behavior or reduce the impact or activities of specific drivers. So you will also see that differentiation throughout the talk. So we talk about current drivers. We did an assessment of a series of reports that have been provided by countries as part of their REDD+ readiness. The background is if you look at the scientific literature, you find a lot of studies that looked at drivers locally or continentally, comparing different situations. You do find very little on drivers on the national level. And that is because perhaps countries were never really asked to look into drivers of deforestation and forest degradation in the past. It's kind of a new thing, one could think. And so that's why they're just starting up and actually gathering data to actually try to assess what drivers are active, how important they are, and how that could link to actual policy. So we try to put together these sources, the RPINs, the RPPs, CIFOR country profiles. There's a couple of studies that have been done, and tried to put that together. We ended up getting data for 46 countries, 46 non-Annex 1 countries, which in total is almost 80% of the total forest area. And you find some results in the report, but there's also a scientific paper that is, it's an environmental researchers that is explaining that in a bit more detail if people are interested in the technical details. So I'm going to go to the results. If we look at deforestation, again, we talk about direct and proximate drivers. So we have 5 different ones that we lumped basically together, two types of agriculture, mining, infrastructure, and urban expansion. This is summed up to 100% for the different continents, Africa, Latin America, and subtropical Asia. And what you see is just compare that, that agriculture, in particular commercial agriculture, is very dominant, in particular Latin America, and then followed by local or subsistence, smallholder agriculture. This is basically summed up to 100%. If you do the same graph, but just impose the net forest change that you get out of the FAO data, you see actually the importance of drivers, but then by net forest change, it's basically net forest loss for developing countries for the very most part, is that you see Latin America has the largest amount of forest loss, and that's why the commercial agriculture being very important there also pops up to be very important there. So what you see about agriculture is estimated to be responsible for about 80%, or most important in an order of 80% for deforestation worldwide. It's very prominent in Latin America, causing about two-thirds, whereas in Africa and subtropical Asia, you see about an almost equal distribution between commercial and subsistence agriculture, whereas the other ones are of minor importance. If you look at degradation, again, it's the same graph, 100%, 3 different continents and 4 different categories. And you see in blue, that is logging, timber logging, which is most important in subtropical Asia and Latin America, less important in Africa, where in fact fuelwood and charcoal are the most important drivers that are active there. I mean, these results kind of make sense, and they're in fact somewhat comparable what you get out of the literature. So, but these assessments was kind of the first try to really put that together from kind of using national data. When it comes to the underlying drivers, what the countries report is quite variable, and since Gabi is going to come back to that a bit, perhaps the most important underlying ones, economic growth, population growth, and the related demand for timber and agriculture products. The key thing is that in the future they're all kind of expected to grow, which is very important to notice. What is also reported by countries is oftentimes weak forest sector governance, institutions, conflicting policies also from other sectors, and tenure issues. Also, that's maybe not too big of a surprise that these things show up there, but that seems to be important things related to causing forest change. But Gabi will come back to that a bit later. I'd like to talk then a bit about the role of drivers in national forest monitoring. And there are, as I said, it's a bit of a new data stream that countries are starting to explore and use as part of their REDD+ readiness. But they are important data. Countries, it's lots of benefits if countries do understand what drivers are active and where and why. It's important for defining interventions. If you planning REDD+ interventions, you do want to address the drivers. Most drivers are in fact outside of the forest sector, so it's also an important pathway to engage with non-forest sectors. It's also important to track them over time, in particular to assess impacts of mitigation. It's also important understanding the drivers in terms of finding priorities on how to set up your monitoring and MRV system. I'll come back to that a bit later. It's important for reference levels, in particular if one thinks about adjusting and reflecting national circumstances. But we have to realize that assessing drivers is an additional requirement. So it does require additional resources in addition to estimating emissions, for example. So that's something that has to be noted. But ideally, both should be very well integrated. So if you looked at these countries and you compare the quality of driver data reported, and you see that here in the Y in basically the vertical axis. And we have different quality indicators for driver data. One is countries would only list the drivers. Second quality, what countries would actually rank them. And the third one, what country would actually provide quantitative data, like 50% of our deforestation is caused by this activity, for example. That's the quality criteria. And if you compare that to the forest area change monitoring capacity that was assessed out of the FAO, you do see there's quite a correlation between the two. So if countries have good data on forest area change, they oftentimes have a pretty good understanding also on the direct drivers that are related to these changes. There are also some deviations, so that we have countries that have good forest area change capacity, area change monitoring capacity, but don't have good data on drivers. That's where an example where countries could actually build upon their forest area change monitoring and interpret drivers as an additional variable, for example. And you also have situations where countries have low forest area change monitoring capacity, but have good driver data, which is a good example where I say that the two monitoring things are not very well integrated, or better coordination could actually help to fill that gap. But so what are some of the methods? What we learn from here is that if you have good forest area change assessments, for example, for remote sensing and analysis, you could interpret, for example, the follow-up land use and the kind of things that happen to the piece of land that after some forest change event has actually happened. You can use spatial context, location, other features such as road networks or changing road network settlements that can help in the interpretation. Very important is local and regional knowledge, so the input from ground observations, from people on the ground, such as communities, local experts, landowners, actors in the forest world. They really have to be, they're really very important there to interpret the kind of changes that are ongoing in the landscapes. It's very little work has been done in actually assessing how much greenhouse gas emissions are caused by a specific driver. That's something that is really starting up. There's just one paper that just recently came out that really looked at that on the global level. So that's really just starting up, but on the national level, there's very little on that. And we have to also realize that some, you may consider drivers of forest land uses, such as agriculture, besides the fact that they cause greenhouse gas emission by converting forests, they also cause greenhouse gas emissions by themselves, such as agriculture, for example, livestock, or forest fires, agriculture fires, or specific type of rice, for example. So that's also something that has, but this is commonly separate. So here's one example. This is the forest area change data from Indonesia from 2000 to 2009. You see this is use of satellite data to interpret the forest change, and also attributed the follow-up land use to that forest change. So whether something is local subsistence agriculture, commercial agriculture, urban infrastructure. So you could, if you use, for example, satellite time series to analyze your forest change data, you can interpret the follow-up land use. That's not an easy interpretation. You need a lot of local knowledge, a lot of regional knowledge that can go into it, but it can be done, and that's if you see countries that have good data on drivers on the national level, that they usually use that kind of approach. I also mentioned that it's very important when you think about drivers and monitoring approaches and data. So I want to show an example where you have carbon stocks on the y-axis and time. And if you have a primary forest and the carbon stocks associated with the primary forest, and you have a deforestation, that's a conceptual model, the carbon stocks go down to a minimum level as kind of a permanent conversion, for example, to grazing land or things like that, as above ground. But if you have different things, you could have natural regrowth, you could have not deforestation, but, for example, continuous lock-in, which is more of a degradation, or shifting cultivation. You have different trajectories of carbon stocks, which are also linked to different drivers. And you would have to use different monitoring approaches, in particular the use of field data versus remote sensing. Some of these balance really changes depending on what kind of main change processes you have ongoing. So it's important if you have a lot of activities, a lot of one driver particularly active in specific areas, that you can tune and adjust your monitoring data and tools according to what driver is active. So it really helps in that regard. In terms of underlying drivers, again, it was mainly on the proximate drivers, the direct drivers. That's often not so easy to assess on a national level. There's been some studies to look at deforestation patterns and underlying causes. Although that is important for reference levels, for example, it's often very difficult. So you see examples of statistical modeling incorporating different kinds of factors, variables, indicators. But oftentimes also these data are not easily available. They often come from other sectors. So what you find is that within nationally, they are often not at the same place. So there's really fundamentally a data coordination and exchange task that has to be usually done first to can actually try to get these data in, to try to relate what you see as direct drivers to those which are related to the underlying ones. And then recording the reference levels, since the forest reference levels or reference emission levels is kind of the first key number that countries perhaps have to provide. Good understanding on historical data and forest change pattern and the related underlying causes are important to reflect national circumstances and particularly to construct scenarios that deviate from the historical trend. That's very important to have a good understanding on driver activities and whether the driver activities may actually change in the future. We have shown that driver data are quite scattered. The quality is quite scattered, variable among the different countries. So as also with other data sources, many countries do not have very good data to actually do that at this point in time. And I guess that's one of the reasons why the idea of a stepwise approach for reference levels have been proposed. That's one of these related proposals that have been made, where you have different time of activity data or emission factor data, but also the quality of the driver data. And depending on what data you have available, you can choose some methods to actually construct simple reference levels to begin with. And as your data and assessments improve, you may apply even more complex and more comprehensive analysis tools. Not going to go in all level of detail here, but the point is that if you have poor data or data which are comparatively low in quality, one can start to look into potential reference levels, but then particular adjustments and modeling approaches should not be based on poor data. So if there's poor data and the data are not very good, then it's not the idea to assess a complex modeling. Then keep things simple, and only if you have good data and you can actually calibrate and validate your model and do good uncertainty analysis, then it's probably useful to run more complex analysis. So for example, if you take about step one, reference levels the way it's proposed here, so for example, the Norway-Guyana agreement, or also the Amazon Fund, these are these kind of simple rule adjustments that you see that have been done using conservative factors or mainly driven by activity data that are being used at this point in time. And these are examples where you can start with what you have and then really try to improve things as capacities improve. Stepwise REDD plus national monitoring is also an issue here. So if people are more interested in that, there is a side event on Wednesday at 3 o'clock by CIFOR and Herold here at the convention center. There's also a related report, and there's also the updated version of the Gold sourcebook. So if people are interested more in the MRV and monitoring, that national forest monitoring side, certainly invite you guys to come and join for this event as well. With that, I would like to close and pass the ball back to Gabi.
So as we look at future drivers, again, it's really important for us to think about the differences between direct drivers and those that are not direct, that really sort of underlie the direct drivers. One of the most important aspects of this is really economic growth, based on the export of commodities and an overall increasing demand for agricultural and timber products. Really important to note, and this is based on analysis that I did looking at 31 different country REDD plans as part of the UN REDD and FCPF. So 31 countries, and 93% of those identified weak forest sector governance issues as being critical. These countries are also facing conflicting agricultural or mining sector frameworks and policies. And a lot of countries, again, 93%, have different activities that are not legal, that are very hard for them to track. So this is, when we talk about, I'll speak in a few minutes about how do we address drivers. This is a really critical issue. And with the underlying drivers, we also have to consider that in many countries, again, of the 31 countries that I looked at, population growth is a large factor. 51% of those countries reviewed are struggling with that. Poverty, 48%, and insecure tenure is reported by 48% of those countries. 41% of those countries are facing international drivers and market forces. A lot of this is commodity-based production, also foreign direct investment. I have here some countries that reference agricultural export commodities as direct drivers don't make the linkage to international and market forces as important in indirect drivers. But in fact, I would say it's most. This is a huge challenge that countries face. And I quickly want to just take you through what the future trends look like. So the important message here is that as we look over the past and we look at driver activity over the past 10 years or the past 20 years, those patterns in developing nations will not play out into the future in the same way. These patterns will change. One of the important aspects of that change is population growth, especially the shift of people into urban areas. We'll have 8.2 billion people by 2030, and a lot of that population growth is going to be occurring in Africa with an extra 235 million by 2030, and Asia and the Pacific, 255 million. When we look at population growth over the next 20 to 30 years, we have this growth period, and then it levels off after about 2050. So when we think about drivers, we're really looking at incredible pressures coming over the next 20 to 30 years. Economic growth is an important way for us to understand driver pressure. There will be quite a lot of growth in Brazil, Russia, India, and China. In the developing world, about half of global economic growth is going to be occurring until, or at least as projected through 2014. And one aspect of this is that mining and other commodities are, as well going to be growing, increasing pressures in those sectors. Again, going back to our current drivers, 80% of forest clearing is attributed to agricultural expansion. And when we look to future trends, this pressure is going to increase. So overall, we know that we'll have about a 70% increase in demand for food products by 2050. Critical commodities in the developing world, such as oil seeds, oil palm, as well as meat and biofuels, will all increase. With the oil seeds, some pretty expansive changes here, 23% increase. Oil palm, 45% increase in output. Malaysia and in Indonesia seeing almost 100% of that. Meat production increasing 85% in volume of meat production by 2050. With the biofuel increase, it's unclear exactly what these pressures will be and where in a spatial sense this will play out, but huge pressures here. And wood products as well. When we look at future trends, the role of plantations is important, and in fact most of our wood fiber will come from these through 2020 and of course beyond. But it's important to note that 80% of the production potential is located in the tropics and the southern part of our world. Another important trend looking at wood products really has to do with, there have been tremendous gains made with import approaches, trying to control the flow of illegal wood, and this has been successful. However, a lot of market demand for wood products will be coming from countries that do not have import controls. So while recent efforts to stem illegal wood flows have succeeded, we need to rethink how this plays out in those emerging economies. And that will also have a huge impact on driver approaches as well. Another important future trend is looking at the use of fuel wood and charcoal. So overall, we've had a decrease of 175 million people being dependent on traditional fuel wood. However, in Africa, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, we'll see a 34% increase in fuel wood use. So huge pressures there. I'd like to spend a little bit of time going over the policy aspects of this. How do drivers fit into REDD policy frameworks, and what can be done? We're going to focus first on national level approaches here. And one of the most important themes that I want to share with you is that when we think about REDD policy approaches, we need to be thinking about three different things. So there are incentives, and there are disincentives, and then enabling measures that can be approached. And oftentimes when we think about REDD, we might think of one thing. We might think about, what incentives, what REDD payments can actually stem forest clearing. And what we're finding from different activities happening around the world is that it really takes a bundle of these things to influence drivers. And we also have policy approaches, which are very important, and incentive-based approaches. So as we think about these tools, these are all tools that at a national scale we can apply to affect drivers. But in order to apply those, we need to be thinking about the underlying drivers as well as direct drivers, and attuning the development of these tools that we can apply to affect those. And again, this idea of, you can't just use one incentive or one enabling measure. We really need to think of these things as a mixture of different approaches that we're going to apply. In the report, we spend a lot more time really describing different case studies of how this works. Again, based on review of 31 national level REDD plans, what I found is that 55% of those countries, as they're in the process of defining what their approach to REDD will look like, and again, these are, when they submit their REDD plans, they will still have to put this out for stakeholder review, and these are not final plans, but initial country plans are tending towards sustainable forest management as the most common approach countries are applying. So 55% of countries are pursuing that. 55% are pursuing fuel wood efficiency and cook stove approaches. 45% looking at the sort of governance and enforcement aspects, really critical. 45% looking at community-based forest management approaches. Agroforestry and tenure and rights by 42% respectively. Cross-sectoral linkages, importantly, is looked at by 32% of those 31 countries. But that's actually, it's a small number given what the pressure is. And then again, we have to think back to 80% of forest clearing is attributed to agriculture, and especially commodity agricultural expansion. And yet, the approach to intensify agriculture as part of a REDD approach is only referenced by 32% of those countries. And another important linkage point here that I want to make is that when you intensify agricultural approaches, it's very important to directly, in a REDD policy framework, to make the linkage then to shifting expansion to areas that are not forest lands, but might be agricultural production lands that are already used, abandoned, or your low carbon stock areas. And only 26% of those 31 national plans that I looked at are identifying that as an important part of their REDD plan. And no country is linking these two. So no country in their REDD plan is specifically saying we're going to intensify agricultural production and we're going to directly then define through land use planning how future expansion can occur on low carbon lands. Another really important aspect when we think about how incentives and enabling approaches can work is this issue of land tenure. And 48% of countries reviewed are struggling with tenure issues and list that as a key factor that they need to address. The illegal logging, of course, is also very important. When we think about the tenure issue, it's very difficult to affect illegal activity if you don't have secure tenure. And there's been some recent work. This was actually an amazing scan that Robinson et al. Produced last year, looking at, I think it was 180 different circumstances where they analyzed impacts on forests and the linkage to tenure, and found that it's a really critical factor. So going back to what Martin was describing, it's really important for countries pursuing REDD to begin to define information approaches that can measure driver activities and impacts. A lot of countries are doing this right now. They're beginning to develop data. Countries are struggling with forestry data that doesn't mesh with the agricultural sector data. A lot of countries, as they're developing their national forest plans, they don't have data on different activities happening, and have a hard time spatially identifying where activity happens and what those changes are over time. So there's a lot of information needs that are out there that need to be addressed. And a lot of countries in their REDD plans are specifically asking for guidance. They're asking for land use change guidance. And they're actually also asking in their REDD plans, they're asking for real support and guidance on how to address this whole agricultural issue and data related to land use change. How to develop the right approaches to that. Again, going back to then shifting from the data and back to the policy framework here. One really important message I would like to leave you with is that, oftentimes we think about in REDD, we think about the finance aspects. We're going to develop the data and MRV systems, and then we're going to get REDD finance up and going, and we're going to get payments for emissions reduction approaches going. And in order for that to happen, to enable that to happen, we need to address drivers. We need to fundamentally figure out how REDD activities are going to shift drivers. And when we think about applying REDD finance, when we look at opportunity cost approaches, we become challenged. And the reason for that is that so many drivers out there, especially, oil palm is perhaps the most amazing example. So the net present value of oil palm on a per hectare basis is $6,000 to $9,000 US dollars. But estimates of carbon credit incentives, it's about $600 to $900 per hectare. How are you going to compete You simply can't if you're using REDD finance alone as a way to affect your drivers. That's why it's so important to think beyond opportunity costs and to think about what other tools and levers you have to actually address this. So a really important aspect then is to think about what laws you can affect and put into place, different fiscal tools that can be applied, public investments, again, the governance aspects, enforcement, tenure approaches. There are many different tools that need to be applied. Again, it's this concept of a whole mixture of different incentives, disincentives, and enabling approaches that need to be applied. The other aspect I just want to leave you with here is this issue of applying approaches that are national in scale. And one of the most important reasons for that is to address the whole leakage issue, which when you're doing a more local approach becomes very difficult to track that and to influence that. I think in the in the essence of time, I'm just going to direct you to, in the report, we actually look at different examples of, again, how intensifying agricultural yields and output needs to be linked to approaches that reduce pressure on forests. There's some great examples, and there was some work that was recently done by the Prince's International Sustainability Unit looking at Brazil, Indonesia, and Ghana. I'd really encourage you to read through that. Some really important models there. But again, this idea that simply intensifying agricultural yields actually increases, in most cases, will increase pressure on forests. So let's just skip over this. I'll just, I think the main point I just want to leave you with here is that there are examples out there of how economic output can continue. Palm oil can continue in a way that does not decrease forest carbon stocks. And the key to that is really appropriately siting new expansion. And different research in the Indonesian context, in the Brazilian context, really spatially identify how agricultural expansion can occur to meet market demand without compromising forests. So this is just a very important message, and the tool here is, again, for the policies, for the incentives, for the disincentives, for the enabling approaches to be applied through land use planning, through a mix of different REDD approaches to affect drivers. And there are some fantastic case examples of this idea that to affect drivers, you have to get out of the forest. You have to look beyond the forestry sector and look at agriculture, look at mining, look at the different sectors, and bring the different sectors together. In Acre State, in Brazil, they're in the process right now. They're actually creating, it's a whole statewide PEZ approach, but it's really defined as a statewide REDD approach that encompasses all of the different land uses. It includes the full range of actors. It's really looking at small-scale agricultural producers as well as large-scale producers, mining, the forestry sector, and they're bringing all of those actors together, setting really emissions targets for each of these, trying to nest that into their national REDD plan, which is great, and then defining the different policies and tools that they can apply to affect drivers. And from what we see right now, Acre has a very strong enforcement ability. So it's likely we're going to see some really tremendous work happening here. When we look to affecting drivers, we have to think about the different scales that driver activity happens at and the different actors that are involved. So again, because so much of the driver pressure comes from market forces, we have to think about demand side and supply side tools. There are some that have been applied in the forestry space, such as the EU FLEGT partnership agreements, which have been very good, have really stemmed the amount of illegal wood products. We also have very important models of sourcing commitments. These are national level sourcing commitments in oil palm and soy. I'll speak more about those in a minute. And we really need to think about here how addressing one driver can affect others. And I think with the model of the EU FLEGT approach, what we're seeing is that those countries that said, we're going to tackle this whole illegal logging issue, and they've done so in such a way that has actually affected their whole governance and enforcement framework, and has really built enforcement abilities. So there have been some great strengths. And again, with these supply and demand side approaches, when we're looking at international commodities, there's a lot of activity that's starting to take place, which is not reflected in a lot of, or most, REDD plans. So a lot of countries that are developing their REDD approaches are not referencing the fact that there are government facilitated commitments. The Dutch and the UK have really led demand side approaches here with oil palm as well as soy, sustainable wood commitments as well. And those need to be brought into REDD plans. There are also import controls, different trade accords that can be applied. There's also a lot of interesting work happening, especially with these commodities, looking at roundtables and sustainability standards, which can really influence commodity production. The other aspect is really the public and private sector commitments. Governments can do a lot to promote public-private sector approaches that directly stem the amount of commodity production that impacts forests. There is also the carbon disclosure and impact area, which from a private sector finance approach can be a huge lever to affect driver approaches and the amount of pressure on forests. One example is the global, carbon disclosure project. And so again, when we're thinking about how do you intervene with drivers, we're thinking about, if you start on the left-hand side here, we have the current drivers. And then the red arrow is the REDD plan and a country's ability to actually do something about this, to try to address the driver pressures. And that really needs to have enabling factors engaged, needs to have the full suite of actors involved. And these approaches need to address the needs at different scales. So from the international scale to the national scale to a local scale. And without bringing all of those pieces together, the enabling factors, the various actors, and the levels in which you have to affect change, it's unlikely that linkage back to affecting drivers, so following that green arrow back over to the far left to affect drivers will not happen. Success will not happen. You need all of those things to be brought together to really affect the driver pressures. So let's conclude with what can we do about this? What can SBSTA and the COP do about this? And what can national approaches to REDD do about this? Again, going just to recap some of what Martin mentioned, you know, a lot of countries are building data right now, and they're trying to track activity data, and they're trying to just understand the scope and scale of drivers happening. But I think one thought that I would like to leave you with is that countries don't have to have perfect information in order to act. A lot of nations out there that are beginning to develop data have enough of a sense of the scope and scale of the key drivers that they can begin to act now. There's no harm done. And there are ways in which they can then track what the current activity is and what the change is. So very important to begin addressing drivers now. Other really important message is, as we look at how to intervene in drivers, yes, it's important to look at what's happening in the forestry space, but it's got to go beyond that. It's got to look at the different sectors that really put pressure on forests. And so when we design what an approach to affecting drivers looks like, it needs to really bring agriculture, mining, the different sectors that are putting pressure on a forest, bring those together and to figure out how to align interests. There's also a need to, again, just ensure that all of those critical aspects that will influence success of intervening in drivers, such as, you know, enforcement abilities, tenure, combating illegal activities, transparency. You know, these are important things that you can do no wrong as a country. If you do nothing else and you begin to address these critical aspects, you will increase your ability to succeed in affecting drivers. And at the so looking beyond the national scale, and again, we look at, you know, commodity pressures and cross-border pressures. There are a lot of activities that can be engaged. Again, countries are facing international driver pressure, and they're not prepared for it. In their REDD plans, countries are looking for tools. They're looking for means by which they can track information here, to share information between nations, and they're looking for tools that they can apply. Finance is a really important tool that can be engaged, as well as, again, as I mentioned before, government-facilitated approaches to influence commodity pressures. And, you know, this can again be related to roundtables, purchasing commitments, trade controls, tariffs, tax approaches. There are a lot of different tools that can be applied here. International information sharing is critical. Countries are asking for this, and I think it's really important to figure out how to actually deliver on country needs here. And the other thought I want to leave you with here is that countries are as well struggling with how do they balance these linkages between REDD+ and broader approaches to adapting to climate change impacts, and whether an agricultural approach under the UNFCCC emerges, and how the agriculture and REDD space merges somehow, and what information needs can be linked together to inform both, you know, creating data to inform decision making, as well as creating the right policy frameworks to address it. So I'd like to thank you very much for joining us. going to hand it over to Steve.